I'm Lilly Ryan. Thank you very much for coming. The talk I'm going to give today is called Scientific Hooliganism. So this is a tale of mischief and mayhem and mustaches, and you'll find out all about that in due course. Before I jump into it though, I want to tell you a little bit about my background. And this is my Twitter handle and my name, in case you'd like to be friends on the internet or say things at me while I'm speaking or afterwards. That's cool. So I am a penetration tester. I work in security. I get paid to be professionally paranoid about computers. It's a good time. I really like it. But before I did that, I was a historian and I studied medieval Europe and I learned Latin and did all kinds of things there. And one of the things that I learned from studying history was that it's really important to look at stuff that happened in the past because that can often inform things that happen in future. And when I started working in tech, I found that there were discussions going on about security and privacy that we were all having that had been had before in lots of different contexts. And I think that by looking back on all of that kind of stuff, we can save ourselves some drama here and now, because a lot of the things that got solved back then could still be solved in similar ways today. And nothing much has changed since the time I'm going to tell you about, except the clothes and the hair. So we'll get into that. So let's wind the clock back a bit. You're in the year 1903. This is the UK. It's in London mostly, but the UK overall, the past. And this is a thing that they had in the past. This is a picture of a telegraph receiver. And I want to explain a bit about how that works, because I know some of you in this room were born after cassettes stopped being a thing. So you may not have used one of these before, and that's cool. I don't want to make assumptions. Anyway, this is a picture of a telegraph receiver, and in 1903, this was about the highest tech you could get. This is the telegraph. It was this electronic communication, and it worked by sending electrical pulses along copper wire. Not much changes, really. But this one used Morse code most of the time to do that. That was a series, it's an alphabet with a series of dots and dashes that corresponded to letters of the alphabet. So the way that would work is you'd write your message down, you'd take it into the telegraph office, and they would dit your message out in dots and dashes and send it to wherever you wanted it to be sent, at the telegraph office at that end. And then they would listen to that series of dots and dashes and write that down on paper, and then they would send that off to the person who it's supposed to be sent to. This was great because it was a lot faster than, putting it on a train or a horse or a ship in order to get it there. But although the tech looked different, a lot of the other stuff around the tech and the drama in the tech community was pretty much about the same as it is today. Here's a nice graph that I prepared for you earlier. Going into exactly how much drama went down among scientists at this point in time would take probably into the evening and into tomorrow morning, because it was a lot. Come and find me after if you want to hear about what happened with the transatlantic telegraph cables, because that is a very good story. Anyway, quick summary of all of this. The telegraph had already changed the world. You had this fast communication, all of that. It was really transformative in the same way that the internet transformed things now. And then the transatlantic telegraph was built, and this was the first time that you could get near instantaneous communication between Europe and America, which was amazing. Suddenly this whole ocean has been broached. You don't have to get on a ship anymore, send your message across and wait 12 weeks. It can happen overnight, which was really cool. And then radio waves were discovered, which blew everyone's minds. They were really cool. Everyone got excited about them, started talking about them the way people talked about serverless in 2016. They wanted to use it for everything. Nobody was sure what it was for. Most people didn't really understand how it worked. They were still figuring that out at the time, but they were excited. They thought, this is cool. This is going to change stuff. This is going to change the way that I build things. That is fun. The other thing about it was that a lot of the laws of physics and electronics that we know today, they didn't know them at that point in time. They were still figuring that stuff out. And so something that we might take for granted now was not exactly the law of physics at that point in time. They were still discovering this stuff. And a lot of their ideas were pretty experimental. So people imagined that the radio could do all of these things. You get rid of the wires, And they were expensive, so that's good. You don't have to roll them out. Cable's expensive, it costs money. Suddenly we could send things through the air. That's cool. You could communicate even more quickly, they thought, because there's an amount of time that it takes for something to go along a copper wire, but if it went through the air, would it go faster? Perhaps. And every single person in 1903 basically wanted to be what they were calling at the time an etheric engineer, which is pretty cool. And I would like to bring that back because that's a cool title to have. Anyway, I wanted to introduce you to the etheric engineers that we care about for this story. First, there's this guy. This is Guglielmo Marconi. He's the dude who normally gets the credit for inventing the radio, and he really shouldn't, but he does. So there's that. He was kind of one of the first startup founders in the way we would think of a startup founder today, a bit like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, but in one person. And he was a really kind of hands-on developer who wasn't afraid to try strange new things when it came to radio tech. He would spend a lot of time getting a length of wire and coiling it up and then seeing how that worked, and then coiling it up some more, rolling it out, seeing how well that transmitted things, trying different mixtures of different kinds of chemicals and metals to see how well they did certain kinds of things. He was really experimental and very hands-on. But he was also really interested in the business potential in his work. And he was not afraid to exploit the relationships he had with pretty much everyone around him in order to make that happen. If he thought it would help his business succeed, he'd probably do it. He didn't care. Another important thing about his radio work is that he was not a formally educated scientist. This is kind of important. He didn't know the theory. He didn't know how any of this really worked. He didn't know he wasn't a physicist. He hadn't had any training. He just worked by trial and error. And in those days, there was a really big divide between what they called, what we would call now scientists, physicists who lectured at universities and that kind of thing. And they treated all this scientific knowledge as like public domain information for the greater betterment of humankind. Pretty much, you'd publish something, it would go out there. And there was this divide between them and practitioners like Marconi, who would just experiment with ideas just to see what would happen. They were often interested in selling these kinds of ideas to make money, that kind of stuff. They hadn't had any formal training. They weren't affiliated with universities. They were just out there doing science in their mum's garage, like Marconi. Actually, it was his mum's attic. Anyway, needless to say, practitioners like Marconi did not get a lot of respect from scientists and the scientific establishment. And that made Marconi's life a little bit difficult. But he was also the great-grandson of John Jamieson, of Jamieson Whiskey. So that meant that his family had a lot of money, and they could bankroll his entire wireless business, which they did. So if you're going to have a drink later and there's any whiskey, you may want to raise a glass, because it pretty much financed the modern radio as we know it. Anyway, this guy you may not have heard of. His name is Neville Maskelyne. Neville Maskelyne was a guy who came from a very long line of men who were all called Neville Maskelyne, which made it so hard to find a picture of him, but I'm pretty sure that that's him. Let's just say that's him. Found it on the internet. Nothing's wrong on the internet, ever. Anyway, Maskelyne was a radio experimenter at the same time as Marconi. He was also a practitioner. He wasn't a trained scientist. And he actually spent a lot of his career as a ghostbuster, which was really cool. So in the early 20th century, in the England and the US, belief in ghosts and spirits became really popular. It was a kind of fad where people would get Ouija boards and hold seances and, light candles and hold hands around tables and that kind of stuff. And a lot of it was built on hoaxes. A lot of people made a lot of money out of other less well-read people. And Maskelyne was a guy who was often called in to prove these people wrong, often by suspicious relatives who were concerned about their relatives spending all their money trying to talk to ghosts. And he used lots of scientific methods to expose all of these spirit mediums as false. And because of this work, he was familiar with a lot of the cutting-edge technology of the time. He was also a magician, which was really cool. Because he ran a theatre in London called the Egyptian, which his dad had run before him, and they would put on magic shows in this theatre. His dad was also a magician. And a lot of his tricks involved radio technology, which was really cool. I mean, a lot of the seance stuff did too, because it was very cutting edge at the time, so a lot of people hadn't really heard of it, didn't know how it worked. It was very mysterious and could be exploited in lots of ways. One of his cool tricks was that he would have a button up on stage, and then there'd be somebody else walking around carrying a bell, and the button, you push it, and the bell would ring, and there'd be no wires, and everyone would go, like this was just a doorbell. But in 1903, that was cool and spooky and amazing. And so he would do lots of, radio stuff in his magic shows. Anyway, he was really cool. We will get back to him. The last person that you need to know about is this guy. This is John Ambrose Fleming. Fleming was, as you can tell by the lab coat, which is, a very accurate picture of him at the time, he was a scientific advisor to Marconi. He was employed by Marconi. His credentials meant that scientists would listen to him because he was an established university physics person who wrote papers and lectured and did all that kind of stuff. So in the eyes of the establishment, he was respectable. And Marconi, the practitioner, had recruited Fleming in order to lend him all of this credibility with the press. And it also really helped that Fleming was a huge Marconi fanboy, like just in his spare time. Loved the guy and loved what he was doing. He would write long articles in the newspapers about all of Marconi's work and how much he thought it was awesome, all of his experiments that he'd been witness to. He was basically like this glorified PR guy in a lab coat. This is Fleming. Okay, so Marconi, Maskelyne, Fleming. These are our three main guys. Keep them in mind. So, in 1903, Marconi had a really big problem. Actually, he had three problems. They were these: syntony, distance, and money. Syntony was, a lot of people at this time, a lot of radio scientists were struggling with this. Syntony is what we think of now as tuning a signal, pretty much. Distance was how far that signal was going to travel. And at that time, the going theory was you could only ever have one at the expense of the other. So you could have a very, very finely tuned signal, but it wouldn't go very far. Or you could have the weakest tuning of a signal ever, and it might go for ages, but you couldn't have both. And Marconi had been struggling with this idea for some time, because for him it was a big blocker to his business. He was running this wireless company, and the very first customers that he really had were on ships. So the tuning over distance thing was really important for ships for a couple of reasons, but mostly for ship-to-shore communication, also ship-to-ship, because, if you think about it, before then, ships had no way of communicating outside of themselves except by, flags, semaphore, flag signs, all that kind of stuff, which relied on vision and was not reliable if it was, raining, which, you're at sea, it's going to happen. So if you had hundreds of ships out at sea, and you all put radios on them, they could then talk to each other, they could talk back to shore, they could, the shore could radio them and say, hey, there's a storm coming, you better get into the bay, and they did this, and lives were saved this way, and this was really revolutionary at the time, and everyone thought it was a brilliant idea, because it was. But the tuning over distance thing was a problem, because if you can't have tuned signals between your ships, all of these ships' signals are going to interfere with each other, and all of these messages get jumbled up, and no one can tell who's saying what to who. And you might as well just go back to flags, because it's not going to work so well. So Marconi was really invested in solving this problem, because this meant it was going to bring in a lot of money for his business if he could convince other people that he'd done it and solved the tuning over distance thing. And Marconi had a monopoly on the ship radio business, pretty much, but other people were trying to edge in on him. So he rushed to lodge this patent for his new tuning technology that he'd come up with. And this patent is, it often gets called the patent of the 4 sevens, because it's got 4 sevens. There's no other deeper reason, it's just that. But what this does is this describes a method of tuning a transmitter and a radio to the same frequency. So Marconi had advertised this radio tuning technology as a security feature because it meant that if you didn't know the frequency someone else was broadcasting, you couldn't listen. You had to tune to the precise frequency that they were broadcasting on in order to hear it. I mean, you know, nowadays with radios and people put their frequencies out there, it's just another feature of the radio. But at this time, Marconi was selling it as a security feature. You can't intercept these, you can't overhear these because you have to know the very secret signal tuning frequency in order to get the message. And this lack of interference, all of that, this was the thing that Marconi was counting on making his money from. And again, because he had a monopoly, he was counting on making a lot of it. But there was one problem. He had not actually worked out how to do this. He just lodged a patent anyway and kind of hoped that, and started advertising and kind of hoped that he would figure it out at some point as he went along, which is, it's like, you know, if they'd invented the iPhone, but the telephone bit didn't work. Yeah, it was kind of like that. He hadn't worked out how to do it. He'd lodged a patent for it anyway. He started advertising and kind of hoped it would all work out. Seems legit. Maskelyne also had some problems around 1903, and they were all Marconi. He hated Marconi, which is fair because Marconi was not really a very nice person. Because Maskelyne was a competing radio engineer who wanted to experiment, he found that every single time that he wanted to do something with this cool radio tech, he was blocked by Marconi because Marconi had gotten there before him, lodged a patent for whatever it was he wanted to do with the radio, and then if you wanted to do that with the radio, you had to pay Marconi a lot of money. And he'd done this in England and in the United States as well, so it didn't really matter where you were. If you wanted to do anything with the radio at all, you had to pay Marconi. And some of these patents didn't even belong to Marconi. Some of them were for things that, as we just saw, Marconi hadn't even come up with properly yet. He just kind of wanted to get there first. And because some of the way that radios work concerns the basic laws of physics, there was no way around that if you wanted to do radio stuff. And he'd patented some of those. So that was a problem. Maskelyne didn't like it. And Maskelyne also knew that Marconi often did not tell the truth about the results of all of these cool radio experiments that he was doing. This was a criticism that a lot of people made about Marconi, not just Maskelyne. Marconi was making a lot of money, but he wouldn't give his investors or anyone else any details about how his radio technology actually worked. And if reporters or anyone tried to come to one of his labs to see him working, he would literally get a black box and put it over the apparatus he was using, so they couldn't see how it fit together and what it was doing. So when Marconi tested something new, he generally wouldn't invite anybody else except for Fleming, who worked for him and thought he was awesome. And so then they'd test something, and Fleming would then go and write this amazing glowing review for the papers, but no one else would ever see what actually went on. Even if the testing didn't really work properly, Fleming would probably write up a whole cool thing about how it had happened. And the reason that Maskelyne knew that Marconi's claims of security of radio technology weren't true was because Maskelyne had actually intercepted some of these uninterceptable transmissions by accident. So Marconi has this radio station down in Poldhu here, which is in Cornwall, where he was in late 1902 testing these tuned transmissions to ships out at sea. It's quite near the sea, so that's handy. And Maskelyne also had a test station nearby. And one day, while he was working on his equipment started receiving these messages, and he's just, okay, this is weird, starts writing them down as they're coming in. And he didn't think much of it at the time, but after a few weeks, he saw an article by Fleming in the newspaper about this cool Marconi thing that had just happened. And he realized that what he had intercepted was actually all of these tests that Marconi said he'd been doing that should not have been able to be intercepted. And Maskelyne also realized that Marconi was lying about his ability to broadcast tuned signals because Maskelyne's equipment hadn't been tuned at all. Not whatsoever. He was still receiving these super secret messages somehow. So this meant that he now had proof that Marconi was trying to con the whole world. And because it was 1903, there wasn't much of a chance that there was going to be anybody else around where Marconi was that had a radio that he hadn't built or that he knew was there. So he felt safe, Marconi did, that he could broadcast this message out into the ether and then lie about how it worked and not expect it to be picked up by anybody. Well, yeah, that didn't work out so well. Anyway, Maskelyne decided to do the right thing and report the vulnerability to the developers. So he sat down, he got his pen out, wrote on some paper, as you do, wrote Marconi a letter to tell him about what he'd intercepted, just like, oh, hey, this is awkward. I don't know if you knew, but I've been getting some of these messages. It looks like there might be a problem with your tech. Just thought you might want to check it out. Okay, thanks, bye. Marconi ignored him. So Maskelyne sat down again a couple of weeks later, wrote him another message. Hey, seeing these ads coming out, just letting you know, I've intercepted these things. Looks like it's your tech. Call me back? Okay, all right. Marconi ignored him. So Maskelyne was pretty pissed off. And when he saw an ad in the newspapers that Marconi was planning to demonstrate this fancy new technology to the public, this was in a lecture in the Royal Institution, which was in London, and it was probably something he was going to make a lot more money from, Maskelyne was even more pissed off. And he was used to exposing people's lies all the time because they were claiming to be talking to ghosts. So now he was going to do it for the radio. So it's showtime. It was June 4th, 1903, which was 115 years and 3 nights ago this very evening. Fleming was at the Royal Institution in London, which was a common venue for these big science lectures. And all of these people with top hats and monocles and walrus mustaches had turned out to see this important demonstration. Fleming was on stage, much like I am, giving this speech about these great new technological developments that Marconi had come up with in the tuning over distance thing, how it had solved all of these problems, and they were going to do a live demo, which is always going to be fun. And Fleming also had 2 assistants to help with the receiver because it was a live demo, so if you got back up, that's great. So Fleming's up here, the assistants are over here working on the telegraph receiver that's going to receive this message that Marconi's going to broadcast from Poldhu down here. So Marconi's not actually in London, he's at his station in Cornwall writing this message to Fleming in London. And the message from him was scheduled to arrive in London at 7 p.m. sharp, just as Fleming's lecture was going to end, for maximum dramatic effect. Meanwhile, Maskelyne was also in London. He had installed a 10-inch induction coil in the basement of the Egyptian Theatre, which was a few blocks from the Royal Institution. And induction coils were pretty old school tech, even by 1903's standards. They were invented in the 1830s. It was really, really old, like first sort of broadcast things. Maskelyne had also set up some rules for his experiment just to make sure that what he was proving was actually true. So he deliberately did not try to tune his broadcaster at all. Not at all, not one bit. He used short waves because Marconi was known to use long waves, because that was also going to be a thing. And he wrote some messages that were, what he said was they were calculated to anger somebody at the receiving end. They're pretty rude. And in order to find out if his experiment worked, he wanted to make sure that he got some kind of reaction from Marconi and his team, so it wasn't going to be a love letter. So, before Marconi's message was received, the assistants on stage noticed that the wireless receiver had started to do something, like some signal was clearly being sent. There was actually a lamp on stage that started to react to the pulses that were being broadcast, because it was so intense. And I wanted to read you a little bit of first-hand testimony from Arthur Block, who was one of the technicians who was on stage with Fleming that night, because it's kind of fun. He was one of these guys standing up here going, oh God, this live demo is the first live demo in the world and it's not working. So, one of the Marconi company's staff was waiting at the Morse printer, and while I busied myself with demonstrating the various experiments, I heard an orderly ticking in the arc lamp of the noble brass projection lantern. It was clear the signals were being picked up by the arc, and we assumed that our men in Poldhu were doing some last-minute tuning up. But when I plainly heard the astounding word rats spelt out in Morse, the matter took on a new aspect. And when this irrelevant word was repeated, suspicion gave rise to fear. There was but a short time to go before the message from Marconi was to be received, and the rats, uncoiling paper tape, gave place to a fantastic doggerel which, as far as my memory serves me, ran something like this. There was a young fellow of Italy who diddled the public quite prettily. A few more lines completed the verse. Quotations from Shakespeare also came through. Imagine Maskelyne at the other end, just like Shakespeare, letter by letter. That's quite some dedication. Evidently something had gone wrong. Was it a practical joke, or were they drunk at Poldhu? Or was it even scientific sabotage? Fleming's deafness kept him in merciful oblivion, and he calmly lectured on. He doesn't even know what's going on. They're back there freaking out. And the hands of the clock, with equal detachment, also moved on, while I, with furiously divided attention, glanced around the audience to see if anyone else had noticed these astonishing messages. All seemed well until my harassed eye encountered a face of supernatural innocence. The face, and then the mystery was solved. The face was that of a man whom I knew to be associated with Mr. Neville Maskelyne and some of his scientific work. He's got a terrible poker face, whoever this guy was. The story ended happily, at least as far as the lecture was concerned. By a margin of seconds before the appointed moment of the arrival of Marconi's message, the vagrant signal ceased, and with as much calm as I could muster, I tore off the tape with these preposterous dots and dashes, rolled it up, and then with the pretense of throwing it away, I put it in my pocket. The message from Marconi followed, and Fleming's luck had held amidst much unsuspecting applause. They got away with it. And the assistants probably went and had a stiff drink afterwards, but they figured they were safe until they told Fleming what had happened. And then Fleming went and stuffed it all up for everybody, at least the Marconi company. He was not pleased at all. When the assistants told Fleming about the rogue messages, Fleming flipped out. And 1903 was 102 years before Reddit was founded. So he couldn't write a post there to sort of vent his spleen. So instead he took up his pen and he wrote a bunch of really angry letters. The first one went to Marconi to let him know what had happened. Dear Mr. Marconi, there was a dastardly attempt to jam us. And if I can find out who did it, it will not be pleasant for him. I don't know what he was going to do. I don't know if he was going to challenge him to a duel. That would have been cool. That's not what happened. I wish it was. And then Fleming wrote a very angry letter to the Times newspaper, because that's what you do when there's no Reddit. Then, pretty much like a school headmaster at morning assembly after somebody set a bin on fire or something, he stared everybody in London down. And there was silence, presumably over breakfast while they were reading it. And he demanded names for whoever had perpetrated these acts of scientific hooliganism. And there's crickets, but okay. And at the same time, he figured that even though this was a huge problem that had nearly overthrown the whole presentation, we can afford to laugh at it, because he theorized that the culprit had used some kind of strong earth current to destroy Marconi's antenna's grounding, and then had broadcast something with a tuned frequency to disrupt that initial receiver. Because he was totally confident that Marconi's tech was solid, and it worked. Marconi hadn't given him this memo. He had never believed anything other than a really sophisticated attack would be able to intercept and hack into what they had been doing at the Royal Institution. Unfortunately for Fleming, writing this letter to the paper was exactly the kind of thing that Maskelyne was hoping that he would do. He wanted that reaction. He wanted to know something had worked. Maskelyne was very happy to out himself in the Times the next day. He emphasized that he had used a simple untuned radiator for his demonstration. And again, with the short waves and the long waves, all of that, he wrote down, I've got this proof that what you've been saying isn't working. And his defense was that this hack was the only possible means of ascertaining fact which ought to be in the possession of the public, which is cool. Because Marconi, as I said, hadn't made the specifics of his tech public at all. He hadn't provided impartial observers to his experiments when they were being run. And he had ignored Maskelyne's messages trying to tell him that something was wrong, all while expecting that a lot of people were going to give him a lot of money for this technology. What was more, Fleming's letter to the paper proved that what Maskelyne had done had worked. So Maskelyne had succeeded in demonstrating that this new tuning technology was vulnerable to jamming and vulnerable to interference, which was the opposite of what Marconi had claimed. Yeah, there wasn't really any good defense to this from Marconi's point of view, but the Marconi company tried really, really hard anyway. The general theme of Fleming's letters back to Maskelyne, and mind you, this was all taking place in the paper, so as day by day, I guess people would open their newspapers and have a look and see the next installment of whatever was going down, spaced out, was that Maskelyne shouldn't have broken in on their demo, because it wasn't fair. That was the defense, basically. Fleming was especially angry that Maskelyne had dared to do this at a lecture at the Royal Institution, which was a hall of science and tradition and sacred learning or something. I don't know, but how dare you do it there? And he had complained that what Maskelyne had done was a ruffianly attempt to upset the experiment, and quite outside the rules of the game. I don't know what those rules are, but Maskelyne apparently violated them. And Fleming was also upset because these attacks were getting in through the back door, which is the first time I've ever heard somebody use the phrase back door to refer to a security vulnerability, which is pretty cool. What happened after this is what happens to a lot of companies who get hacked and then try to cover it up. The Marconi company's shares nosedived. And Fleming especially suffered. His reputation was completely destroyed because he was the establishment scientist who had put his entire reputation on the line and vouched for Marconi over and over and over. And Marconi fired him, just to add to that. He fell out of favor for a few years with the scientific community for being a massive sellout and a liar, and went back to his books for a few years, but like a lot of important people who screwed up, it didn't seem to matter much after a bit of time, because Marconi rehired him a little while later. And eventually Fleming invented what would become the vacuum tube, which was kind of a big deal, so he was fine. Don't feel too bad for him. But what's more important is the fact that the Maskelyne affair sparked this whole public debate about security and due diligence, which had never been had before, really. Because firstly, this whole demonstration pointed out that if tuning was ever going to work properly, there needed to be regulation of frequencies and transmitting devices and all of that kind of thing, which is, as we know, how radio still works today. And signals still get messed up if you buy a car alarm or a doorbell from a country that doesn't have the same regulations as yours and then you try to operate it there. Some of you may have experienced this. The other thing that came out of this hack was a conversation about, the responsible intersection of commerce and science, pretty much, which had also not been something that had been discussed much before. Because before Marconi, scientists did science mostly just to discover new things about the universe for its own sake. But nobody had really come along and patented all of this stuff before. So this was a new one for them. The general feeling was that if you were going to use the laws of the universe to make a profit for yourself, you owed it to the public to try and get those laws right and get your tech right. And this meant that you had a moral responsibility to be clear about when things went wrong, because this would make things better for everyone. So, okay, you're probably thinking, this is a cool story, Lily, whatever, it's like 100 years ago, how is this useful? This is how. Marconi's side of the story has a lot to offer developers, most businesses, people who build software. It's a textbook example of how not to behave when you're trying to sell a cool new thing. So, first, here are some things to remember. Open source has always been a good idea. Technology always works best when you share the details of what you're doing with other people and you let them see. Open sourcing your stuff means that people can look at it. This is good. It means they might see things that you didn't and help you make them better. Proper testing is really important. Test your work. If you only test the expected user paths, you're only going to find the bugs that you expect to find. Test your edge cases and your fail cases and all of the other worst case scenario cases that you can think of, or one of your customers is going to find that bug instead. Third, be honest about your struggles. If something is taking time, or you don't know how to figure something out, be open about it. Communicate with people when you're having trouble, because it looks good when you can deliver something on time, but it looks much better when you can be honest about your product and set appropriate expectations with your customers and your investors. And then you don't burn yourself out trying frantically to catch up about something that you've tried to cover up and lie about. And last, don't forget about the old tech. Just because you've patched your servers against all the latest bugs, they're not going to fall into heartbleed territory. There's nothing like that. Don't forget to also make sure that they're still not vulnerable to things like SQL injection. Because this is like having a very expensive security camera system in your house and then leaving your window open. You've got to cover all of your bases, even the really old things. Maskelyne's side of the story is actually a really good example of what to do if you find a bug in someone's work. Because if you find yourself in his position, you need to pretty much do what he did. Firstly, if you see something that's not right, speak up about it. Say something. It helps to make the software better for everybody. Secondly, notify the developers first. Don't go public immediately if you find a bug. This is not a good idea. This is really irresponsible. Makes a whole lot of people vulnerable to attack because now everybody knows that the bug is there. It's much better to reach out to the people who made the product first and give them an opportunity to fix the things broken before you tell everybody about it. Third, stop before you do damage. So if this bug is really bad and the developers are not doing anything, the company who makes the product is refusing to fix it, you've tried to contact them multiple times, you've done your due diligence, you've reached out, you've provided them multiple opportunities to do things. This is where you might need to demonstrate the bug publicly somehow. But make sure that your demonstration only goes far enough to prove your point. Don't go any further. Don't do damage. Just don't go and steal information just to prove that you can, because that makes you just as bad as the people who won't fix the bug in the first place. Make sure that you know where the line is when you're going to do this. There is a lot that I really like about this story, but the thing I like the most about it is the fact that I get to share it with people sometimes, and that's really cool. So I would really like to thank you for coming and taking the time to listen. Cheers.